What I'd like to do, though, is cover 4 key issues today around evidence from an industry perspective. And I'll be talking both from a pharmaceutical industry and a medical technology, medical device industry perspective as well. I want to look at how we recognize that there is an increasing and a broadening demand for evidence. Give you some insights as to how we plan for that evidence. Some steps we've taken to reduce the uncertainty in evidence. And then also to illustrate that this is a very dynamic field and environment, some of the new considerations which are currently challenging the industry and the broader environment. So I'd like to start with a place where I think we can put all pretty much align and recognize. It's true that in historical times there was a focus from a customer base and for evidence around particularly the physician and the patient. But over the last 15 years, we've seen an increase in recognition that we also need to be providing evidence for the provider. And not just the provider, but also the person writing the checks, the payer. And more recently, a better recognition that actually the policymaker is key, particularly in markets that are looking to do universal healthcare coverage. So when we're building our journey to evidence, it's those 5 Ps that they've become known, but they're not the only customers. We also, in a number of markets, need to recognize the employer and the caregiver, the broader societal perspective, and recognize that industry is also a key customer. I'm not going to go through the list of the different types of evidence that they value, but it's very broad-ranging. A number of people, a number of customers like to focus in on overall survival or ultimate outcomes. That's particularly key from an HTAi perspective. Other customers, other stakeholders are happy with interim benefits, and we have to balance that from an industry perspective when we're designing our studies. From an economic perspective, some customers are focused on acquisition cost or budget impact, while others are focused on opportunity costs. But not all of the evidence is purely costs and outcomes. There are other aspects of value that we need to consider, such as improving efficiency. It may be around reducing a training burden in a surgical procedure, making decision-making more certain through the use of diagnostics, improving safety risks, providing flexibility in assets by providing procedures or technologies that shift the site of care, or considering the patient or carer perspective by looking at less invasive technologies or increasing their own productivity, be that back to work or just social activities. And we've heard that there's a broad diversity in market types, both in terms of development, as Sir Michael indicated this morning, but also in payer types. And the other issue we need to consider is it's not just in degrees of development or funding, it's in the types of decisions that we're looking to inform. From one extreme, where there's free pricing and the focus is purely on the clinical evidence, through the HTAi types of markets, where there's a focus on clinical effectiveness and then an economic negotiation, through those markets which focus on cost effectiveness and look at QALYs, through to those which are more economic focused and intent on tendering. And we have to address all of these. So looking at pharmaceutical development to start with, I'm just putting up here a timeline of the development of a pharmaceutical that will hopefully be, most of you will recognize, from discovery, early development, through the phases of clinical development, regulatory review, and launch. From a pharmaceutical company's perspective, they have to have a very clear idea of the evidence they want before they start phase 2. There is time to tailor that, but that evidence plan is effectively locked going into phase 3. Yes, there are opportunities for other evidence generation through observational studies and cohorts, but as even in light of what Sir Michael said this morning, many agencies still like our evidence collected as part of that phase 3 plan. When it gets reviewed by an HTAi agency, though, it's interested in how that evidence stacks up to the current standard of care when it's going to be used in the patient, quite rightly so. But that means when we're planning our evidence, we're effectively trying to predict the future. And that future prediction is often 4 to 7 years out. We need to be able to predict what that standard of care is going to be like. So there's a degree of future-proofing required in our clinical studies because the standard of care is going to change over time. And so the ability now to build in things like indirect comparisons, meta-analyses, mixed treatment comparisons, is a growing interest both from the industry and the payer community. And so with that context, I want to talk a little bit about how we look to reduce that uncertainty in evidence generation. And I think here we need to split it into what's avoidable and what's not avoidable. So avoidable uncertainty is something that we have in our control, and it's rightly, the onus is on us to do what we can to reduce that uncertainty. And the issue here is around good evidence collection and good trial designs. And as somebody who's seen the evolution over the last 10 years, I think industry has got somewhat better at developing better clinical trials. We've got more meaningful endpoints. We're including more patient-reported outcomes in general. We've got more realistic trial duration, and there are more active comparators in clinical research than there were 10, 15 years ago. And a significant step towards this in recent times has been the growth of early advice. So that ability to enter into a meaningful dialogue with the HTAi agencies and the payers. But for that to be useful, it does need to be informed. It does need to come on a very open and transparent basis so we can have an open and meaningful dialogue around the key issues of that trial design. It needs to be specific. They need to be able to understand the clinical situation and the issues that we're trying to address from an industry perspective and provide meaningful, unbiased feedback on that. And there are a number of new models arising in this area. And one request that I would say is that please engage industry as these are designed, because it needs to understand where industry is coming from and the kind of issues that industry needs to address for them to adequately inform our R&D programs. There is also an issue around unavoidable uncertainty. And there are some issues we can't deliver at launch for an innovative technology, such as overall survival in chronic diseases or indolent tumors, such as 10, 15 years follow-up in a new orthopedic device, or longer-term outcomes when we're changing the mindset of treating a new condition, such as addressing Alzheimer's earlier in the R&D phase. And I think we need a collaborative method here, recognizing that we can only deliver a certain degree of follow-up at launch and work together to generate that longer-term evidence as we move forwards. But there are new issues arising in evidence generation. And it's clear that it's been recognized a number of times that the innovation model for R&D is unsustainable in its present form. It's becoming increasingly costly. The remaining targets are higher risk. And it's much more expensive now looking at the biologics and some of the more important, some of the greater clinical areas of clinical unmet need that we're trying to address, such as Alzheimer's, as I indicated earlier. And I think that's been reflected on this chart here. This indicates the number of collaborations in the industry over the last 10 years. So this is one way the industry is starting to address the increased risk and the increased cost of the current evidence environment. But this, too, introduces new issues, because a number of these collaborations won't start until phase 2 or phase 3. And so the ability to influence those development plans comes later in the pipeline. Another issue is, pardon me, is the change in the regulatory environment for pharmaceuticals. Recently been announced that the FDA has created a new status in drug regulation called for breakthrough therapies, which is for areas of significant unmet need and potential huge, significant benefit. Now, this may be considered a US-focused issue, but the studies which go into developing these products are by design global. And if the US takes an approach that cuts those trial designs, that development time shorter, then that has a global implication. And a similar issue in Europe is that, oh, thank you very much. I was running out of water. And in Europe, we have a similar approach where the EMA is now talking about adaptive licensing, looking at regulatory approval across the product life cycle. And the issue here is, if the regulators are looking to evolve to a more longitudinal approach, then HTAi needs to adapt also. And we need to find ways of working together to find access in a dynamic pathway. And it's good to see that the HTAi Policy Forum has made this the key issue of its discussions during 2014. Now, a quick a quick mention for medical devices and the issue around evidence generation. The issue here is really disconnection. HTAi seeks to review medical devices like a drug. It wants evidence now to demonstrate certainty. But then we procure it like a commodity. We want discounts and price volume agreements. In pharmaceuticals, though, we get a guaranteed exclusivity period, even if the patent life is short. We get 5 years data exclusivity in the US, 10 in Europe, which means that there's an opportunity for that innovator to get a return on the investment for the evidence that they've generated. The ecosystem incentivizes that evidence generation. However, in medical devices, there is no data exclusivity. There is patent protection, but it's easier to get around a patent for a physical device than it is a biological. And what we see is that HTAi requires evidence of that innovator into the marketplace, so the innovator generates the evidence. But because reimbursement is normally by a procedure, not by a particular device in medical devices, procurement are free to take any device. And so they are willing to accept the evidence from that first in market and extrapolate it to future technologies. And so that provides a first mover disadvantage, and the ecosystem is undermining evidence generation. And if you want more on that topic, there is an industry symposium, I believe in this room, 103, at 1:30 today, where there will be a much more deeper dive on these issues. So my final slide, how do we link evidence, value, and access? Well, the whole reason that industry is developing evidence is to demonstrate value, to create access for patients. And I think that's everybody's ultimate goal here, whatever stakeholder perspective you're taking. But it's clear the health systems are evolving, and the environment within which we're developing technologies is changing. And so HTAi methods cannot stay static in time. They need to adapt. As regulators move to a life cycle approach, then we need to be considering how we can modify and adapt the HTAi processes to work more longitudinally and work collaboratively with those 5 Ps, the key stakeholders, to provide managed access. But finally, if we want value, we should also consider differential pricing. As Sir Michael indicated earlier, there is huge variation in the economic development, local priorities, and infrastructure across the markets. And if we want value and we price for value, then we need to think about refraining from reference pricing. We need to refrain from product diversion, where actually nobody wins from the stakeholder's perspective. It's an external third party. The healthcare system loses out and the innovator loses out. Just one final example. I won't talk about it in detail. My time is up. But this is a new drug for multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis, where we're trying and considering looking at equitable tiered pricing as a way forward. But for that, we need to be working with decision makers, both in low, middle-income countries, but also in developed markets, to make sure that this is a sustainable model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian.